Chapter 1. The Last Guardian. The wind howled across the central wastelands like the dying breath of ancient gods, carrying with it the scent of ash and something far worse. Kael Dragonheart pulled his dragon-scale cloak tighter around his shoulders as Pyraxis descended through the gray clouds, her massive golden wings cutting through air that seemed to thicken with each mile they traveled deeper into the cursed lands. Below them stretched a landscape that had once been the heart of a thriving civilization. Now it was a patchwork of cracked earth, twisted metal, and the bleached bones of creatures that had died in wars both recent and ancient. The central wastelands bore the scars of 5 centuries of conflict, but today Kael sensed something different in the desolation, something that made his dragon bond tingle with unease. "Do you feel it too, old friend?" Kael asked, his voice carried directly to Pyraxis through their telepathic connection. The great dragon's response came as a wave of concern mixed with ancient recognition, emotions too complex for words but perfectly clear through their bond. Pyraxis had lived for over 800 years, long enough to remember when the wastelands had been green fields and prosperous cities. She had fought in the last great war against the Void Wraiths, had seen her fellow dragons fall one by one as the shadow creatures consumed everything in their paths. The memories she shared with Kael were fragments of nightmare cities, drained of all life, warriors reduced to empty husks, and darkness that seemed to devour light itself. They landed on a ridge overlooking what had once been the fortress city of Aethermoor, the last stronghold of the dragon riders. The ruins stretched for miles, massive stone blocks scattered like a child's toys by forces that defied comprehension. But it wasn't the familiar devastation that had drawn Kael here. It was the reports from the few traders brave enough to cross the wastelands. Stories of shadows that moved without casting them, of plants withering at the touch of an unseen blight. Kael dismounted and walked to the edge of the ridge, his boots crunching on ground that felt brittle beneath his feet. The dragon-scale armor he wore had been crafted by his grandfather, one of the last true dragonsmiths, and it hummed with protective enchantments that had kept him alive through a dozen battles. But today those enchantments felt strained, as if they were working harder than usual to ward off some invisible threat. There, Pyraxis rumbled, her great head turning toward a section of the ruins where the shadows seemed deeper than they should be. The darkness gathers where light should fall. Kael followed her gaze and saw what she meant. In the ruins of what had been Aethermoor's great library, shadows pooled in defiance of the afternoon sun. The darkness writhed and shifted like living smoke, and where it touched the ancient stones, they seemed to lose their color and substance. "Void corruption," Kael whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He had read about it in the few surviving texts from the Age of Shadows, but seeing it firsthand sent ice through his veins. The Void Wraiths had been banished 500 years ago, sealed away in the depths beneath the world by the combined sacrifice of the last dragon riders and their bonded companions. The seals should have held for millennia. Pyraxis lowered her great head so that Kael could climb onto her neck, and together they glided down toward the corrupted ruins. As they drew closer, the wrongness in the air became almost overwhelming. The shadows weren't just dark, they were empty, devoid of the natural essence that filled all living things. They were holes in reality itself, places where the Void Wraith's hunger had begun to seep back into the world. "The seals are weakening," Pyraxis observed, her mental voice heavy with sorrow and fear. "The ancient bindings that hold them in the depths grow thin. Soon they will break free entirely." Kael studied the corruption with the trained eye of someone who had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment. His grandfather had taught him the signs to watch for, the subtle indicators that would herald the return of humanity's greatest enemy. But knowing what to look for and actually seeing it were two very different things. "How long do we have?" Kael asked, though he dreaded the answer. Pyraxis was quiet for a long moment, her ancient mind calculating possibilities and probabilities with the wisdom of centuries. "Months, perhaps a year if we are fortunate. But Kael, you must understand what this means. The Void Wraiths grow stronger by feeding on conflict and despair. The endless wars between the kingdoms have been nourishing them, weakening the seals with every battle fought. Every life lost in hatred rather than hope." The implications hit Kael like a physical blow. For the past 50 years, the 5 kingdoms of Aethermoor had been locked in an escalating series of conflicts. The northern ice realm fought the western mountain kingdoms over mining rights in the frozen peaks. The southern desert principalities raided the eastern forest clans for water and timber. Ancient grudges and territorial disputes had created a web of hatred that seemed impossible to untangle. And all the while, the Void Wraiths had been growing stronger, feeding on the negative emotions that war generated like parasites drawing sustenance from an infected wound. "The kingdoms have to be warned," Kael said, but even as he spoke the words he knew how futile they sounded. He was the last dragon rider, a relic of an age that most people considered myths. The rulers of the 5 kingdoms saw him as either a curiosity or a threat. depending on their mood and political needs. None of them would listen to warnings about ancient evils when they were too busy fighting each other. They will not believe. Pyraxis agreed sadly. Humans have short memories and shorter patience for inconvenient truths. They will dismiss your warnings as attempts to manipulate their politics or gain advantage in their petty conflicts. Kael climbed down from Pyraxis's neck and approached the edge of the void corruption, stopping just short of where the shadows began to writhe with unnatural life. He could feel the wrongness of it pressing against his mind, a cold hunger that sought to drain away hope and joy and leave only empty despair in their place. Then we'll have to make them believe, Kael said, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. Somehow, we have to unite the kingdoms before the Void Wraiths break free completely. It's the only way to stop them. Pyraxis's response carried both pride and sorrow. She had watched Kael grow from a frightened boy who had stumbled into her lair to the man he was today, and she knew the burden he was accepting. The last dragon riders had died trying to unite the kingdoms against the Void Wraiths, and their failure had cost them everything. The prophecies speak of a time when the kingdoms will stand together against the darkness, Pyraxis said. But they also speak of great sacrifice and the price of unity. Are you prepared to pay that price, young guardian? Kael looked out over the corrupted ruins of Aethermoor, thinking of all the dragon riders who had died defending this place. His grandfather had been among them, along with his dragon companion Stellarwing. They had given their lives to buy time for the sealing ritual, knowing that future generations would have to face this threat again. I'm the last guardian, Kael said simply. If I don't try, who will? As if in response to his words, a sound echoed across the wastelands that made both Kael and Pyraxis freeze in terror. It was a howl that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself, a cry of hunger and hatred that spoke of endless darkness and the consumption of all light. The void corruption in the ruins pulsed and expanded, reaching out like grasping fingers toward the living world above. They know we're here, Pyraxis said, her great muscles tensing for flight. The Void Wraiths can sense the dragon bond, the light that connects us. We must leave before they send their servants to investigate. Kael took one last look at the spreading corruption, memorizing every detail, so he could describe it to the kingdom rulers. Then he climbed onto Pyraxis's back and held tight as she launched herself into the sky with powerful wing beats that carried them away from the cursed ground. As they flew toward the borders of the inhabited lands, Kael's mind was already working on the seemingly impossible task ahead of him. 5 kingdoms, 5 proud rulers, centuries of hatred and mistrust. And somewhere among them, according to the ancient prophecies, was a traitor who served the darkness willingly. The wind carried them over the first signs of civilization, farms and villages that marked the edge of the Eastern Forest Clan's territory. Below, Kael could see the smoke of cooking fires and the movement of people going about their daily lives, unaware that an ancient evil was stirring in the depths beneath their feet. Where do we start? Kael asked, though he already knew the answer would be difficult. With the one who faces the greatest immediate threat, Pyraxis replied. Queen Liana of the Ice Realm. Her northern borders are closest to the old seal sites. If the Void Wraiths break through anywhere first, it will be there. Kael nodded, adjusting their course toward the frozen north. Queen Liana Frostborn was known for her pragmatic approach to politics and her fierce protection of her people. If anyone might listen to warnings about supernatural threats, it would be her. But she was also locked in bitter conflict with King Magnus of the Mountain Kingdoms, a war that had been raging for 3 years over disputed mining claims. As Pyraxis's wings carried them toward what might be their first diplomatic mission, or their final failure, Kael reflected on the weight of his inheritance. He was not just the last dragon rider, but the keeper of humanity's last hope against an enemy that had nearly destroyed civilization once before. The sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Kael uncomfortably of the colors he had seen in the void corruption. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay the answers he needed, the allies he had to find, and the unity that seemed impossible to achieve. But as Pyraxis had said, he was a guardian. And guardians did not give up, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. Chapter 2. Kingdoms at War. The battlefield stretched across the Thorn Pass Valley like a wound carved into the earth itself, scarred by magic and littered with the debris of war. Kael watched from Pyraxis's back as 2 armies clashed in the narrow mountain pass, their banners snapping in the cold wind, the silver and blue of Queen Liana's Ice Realm against the bronze and gold of King Magnus's Mountain Kingdoms. Ice magic met earth magic in spectacular and deadly displays. Liana's warriors conjured walls of frozen air that shattered against Magnus's stone barriers, while mountain soldiers hurled boulders that exploded into deadly shrapnel against shields of crystallized frost. The very air crackled with competing energies as mages from both sides wove spells designed to kill rather than protect. 50 years of this madness, Pyraxis observed, her mental voice heavy with disgust. They tear each other apart while the real enemy gathers strength in the darkness below. Kael had spent the past 3 weeks attempting to arrange meetings with the 5 kingdom rulers, and this battle was the result of his latest diplomatic failure. He had managed to convince both Queen Liana and King Magnus to consider a temporary truce for discussions about mutual threats, but their deep-seated hatred had erupted into violence before any meaningful dialogue could begin. The immediate cause had been a dispute over mining rights in the Thorn Pass, but Kael suspected deeper manipulation at work. Someone wanted the kingdoms fighting, wanted them weakened and divided, when the Void Wraiths finally broke free from their ancient prison. "We have to stop this," Kael said, though he knew how futile the gesture would be. Dragon Riders had once been peacekeepers, mediators who could end conflicts through the sheer moral authority of their position. But that was when there had been dozens of riders, when their order commanded respect across all the kingdoms. Now there was only Kael, and his warnings about ancient evils sounded like the ravings of a madman to rulers consumed by immediate concerns. Pyraxis began her descent toward the battlefield, her massive form casting a shadow that caused both armies to pause in their fighting. Dragons were rare enough that most soldiers had never seen one, and the sight of Pyraxis's golden scales and ancient scars commanded attention even in the heat of battle. Kael guided his mount to land on a rocky outcropping that overlooked the main fighting, a position that would allow him to address both armies without favoring either sides. As Pyraxis settled her great bulk on the stone, her presence seemed to create a bubble of relative calm in the chaos of war. "Warriors of the Ice Realm and Mountain Kingdoms," Kael called out, his voice magically amplified to carry across the battlefield. "I am Kael Dragonheart, last of the Dragon Riders, and I bring warnings of a threat that makes your current conflict seem like a children's game." The response was immediate and predictable. Soldiers from both armies jeered and shouted insults, their blood still hot from battle, and their minds closed to anything that might interrupt their righteous fury. But Kael also saw some faces turn toward him with curiosity or concern. Warriors who remembered the old stories about dragon riders and their role as protectors of all humanity. Queen Liana herself emerged from the Ice Realm battle lines, her silver hair gleaming beneath a crown of crystallized frost. She was a striking woman in her mid-30s, tall and regal with the kind of presence that commanded attention even without magical enhancement. Her ice-blue eyes fixed on Kael with a mixture of irritation and calculation. "Dragon Rider," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of absolute rule. "Your timing is poor. We are in the middle of settling a territorial dispute with these mountain barbarians." From the opposing lines, King Magnus stepped forward with the heavy tread of someone accustomed to making the earth itself bend to his wills. He was shorter than Liana, but built like the mountains he ruled, with broad shoulders and arms that spoke of years spent working forge and mine. His bronze crown was worked with symbols of earth and stone, and his dark eyes burned with the fury of someone who considered himself wronged. "Barbarians!" Magnus roared, his voice enhanced by earth magic, to boom like an avalanche. "Your Ice Witch soldiers have been raiding our mining camps for months, stealing ore that belongs to the mountain kingdoms by ancient right." "Ancient right?" Liana's laugh was like the sound of icicles breaking. "Your people have been strip mining the Thorn Pass for 3 years, poisoning the streams that feed our northern settlements. We take only what is needed to protect our people from your greed." Kael watched the exchange with growing frustration, recognizing the pattern that had repeated itself across all 5 kingdoms. Each ruler had legitimate grievances against their neighbors, real injuries and injustices that had been building for decades. But the intensity of their hatred seemed disproportionate to the actual conflicts, as if something was amplifying their natural antagonisms. "Your Majesties," Kael interrupted, his voice cutting through their argument with the authority of desperation. "While you fight over mining rights, the Void Wraiths gather strength in the depths beneath your feet. I have seen the corruption spreading in the central wastelands, the ancient seals weakening with each day that passes. If you do not unite against this threat, there will be no kingdoms left to rule." The silence that followed was broken by Magnus's harsh laughter. "Void Wraiths? Ancient seals? Dragon Rider, you speak of children's stories, myths told to frighten the weak-minded. The only threats we face are the ones standing before us with weapons drawn." Liana nodded in agreement, her expression skeptical. The Void Wraiths were banished 5 centuries ago, if they ever existed at all. Most scholars believe they were simply a metaphor for the chaos that followed the fall of the old empire. "You ask us to abandon real conflicts for imaginary dangers." Kael felt Pyraxis's frustration matching his own, as the great dragon shifted restlessly on her rocky perch. They had encountered this same dismissive attitude from Prince Rashid of the Desert Principalities and Elder Theron of the Forest Clans. The rulers were so focused on their immediate enemies that they couldn't see the greater threat approaching. The corruption is real, Kael insisted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I can take you to see it, show you the places where reality itself is being consumed by void hunger. The ancient texts speak clearly about the signs of their return, and every one of those signs is manifesting now. Ancient texts written by dragon riders, Magnus said dismissively. Your order has always claimed special knowledge, special authority to interfere in the affairs of kingdoms. Perhaps these signs are simply convenient excuses to insert yourself into our politics. The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. Dragon riders had historically served as mediators and peacekeepers, roles that inevitably involved them in political disputes. But Kael's grandfather had taught him that their true purpose was protection against supernatural threats, dangers that ordinary armies couldn't face. I seek no political advantage, Kael said, his voice tight with controlled anger. I am the last of my order, bonded to a dying dragon, with no lands or armies to command. What could I possibly gain by lying about this threat? Lyanna studied him with calculating eyes, her expression softening slightly. Perhaps you believe what you say, Dragon Rider. Isolation and loss can play tricks on the mind, make shadows seem like monsters and coincidences appear as omens. But even if your warnings were true, what would you have us do? Abandon our legitimate grievances and trust our enemies? Yes, Kael said simply. Because if the Void Wraiths return in full force, your enemies will be the least of your concerns. They consume life itself, drain the essence from everything they touch. No kingdom can stand against them alone, no matter how powerful their magic or how strong their armies. Magnus spat on the ground, his contempt evident. Pretty words, but words don't settle territorial disputes or protect mining rights. If you want to chase shadows and ancient myths, that's your choice, but don't expect us to abandon our real responsibilities for your fantasies. The king turned to address his army, his voice booming across the battlefield. Warriors of the mountain kingdoms. We came here to reclaim what is ours by right, not to listen to the ravings of a madman. Form ranks and prepare to advance. Lyanna's response was equally swift and decisive. Ice guard, defensive positions. Show these mountain fools the price of their greed. As both armies prepared to resume their battle, Kael felt a crushing sense of failure. He had hoped that his reputation as a dragon rider would carry enough weight to at least get a hearing, but the rulers were too consumed by their immediate conflicts to consider larger threats. We should leave, Pyraxis advised, her mental voice heavy with sorrow. There is nothing more we can accomplish here. Perhaps the other kingdoms will prove more receptive to reason. But as Kael prepared to signal for takeoff, a new sound echoed across the battlefield. A low, mournful howl that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The temperature dropped noticeably, and shadows began to gather in places where no shadows should exist. Both armies froze as the unnatural sound washed over them, their magical energies flickering and dimming as if something was draining the power from their spells. Horses reared in terror, and even the most battle-hardened veterans looked around with growing unease. What is that? Lyanna demanded, her voice sharp with sudden fear. Kael's blood ran cold as he recognized the sound from his nightmares and Pyraxis's ancient memories. Void Wraiths, he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent battlefield. They're testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses in the seals that bind them. The howl came again, longer and more insistent, and this time it was answered by similar cries from different directions. The Void Wraiths were stirring across multiple seal sites, their hunger growing stronger as they sensed the conflict and hatred that fed their power. Magnus and Lyanna exchanged glances, their animosity temporarily forgotten in the face of something that defied their understanding. The sound was wrong in ways that went beyond mere noise, carrying implications of emptiness and hunger that touched something primal in every listener. This is what I've been trying to warn you about, Kael said, his voice cutting through the unnatural silence that followed the howls. The Void Wraiths grow stronger with every battle you fight, every life lost in hatred rather than hope. Your wars are feeding them, giving them the power they need to break free from their ancient prison. For a moment, Kael thought he might have finally broken through their skepticism. Both rulers looked shaken by the supernatural display, their certainty about the nature of reality clearly challenged by something that shouldn't exist. But then Magnus shook his head, his expression hardening with renewed determination. Tricks and illusions, he declared, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. Dragon magic designed to frighten us into submission. I won't be manipulated by parlor tricks and ancient superstitions. Lyanna hesitated longer, her analytical mind clearly struggling with what she had experienced. But eventually, she too dismissed the evidence of her senses. Whatever that was, it changes nothing about our immediate situation. We still have real enemies and real grievances that must be addressed. As both armies prepared to resume their battle, Kael realized that even supernatural intervention might not be enough to convince the rulers of their danger. They were too invested in their conflicts, too certain of their righteousness, to consider that they might be wrong about the nature of the threats they faced. "Come," Pyraxis said sadly. "We have other kingdoms to visit, other chances to plant seeds of understanding. Perhaps when the signs become impossible to ignore, they will remember your warnings." As Pyraxis launched herself into the sky, carrying Kael away from the renewed battle below, he couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out faster than he had hoped. The Void Wraiths were growing bolder, testing their bonds more frequently and with greater strength. Somewhere among the 5 kingdoms was a traitor who served the darkness, someone who was actively working to prevent the unity that might stop the ancient enemy. Until Kael could identify and neutralize that threat, his warnings would continue to fall on deaf ears. The war between ice and stone resumed below them, adding its violence and hatred to the feast that nourished humanity's greatest enemy. And in the depths beneath the world, ancient hungers stirred with growing anticipation. Chapter 3. Ancient Prophecies. The ruins of Drakmoor's great library rose from the cursed earth like the ribs of some massive beast, its broken walls and shattered towers a testament to the power that had once been wielded here. Kael guided Pyraxis through the maze of fallen stones and twisted metal, searching for the entrance to the archive sanctum where the most important Dragon Rider texts had been stored. 3 days had passed since the failed diplomatic mission at Thorn Pass, and Kael's frustration had driven him to seek answers in the one place that might still hold them. If the kingdom rulers wouldn't listen to warnings about the present danger, perhaps the ancient prophecies could provide guidance about how to convince them. "The entrance should be near the base of the Starfall Tower," Pyraxis said, her ancient memory providing navigation through the devastation. "Your grandfather showed me the hidden passages when I was barely more than a hatchling." Kael dismounted and began searching among the rubble, looking for the distinctive dragon-carved stones that marked important entrances. The corruption he had seen spreading through other parts of the ruins hadn't reached this section yet, but he could feel its presence like a cold weight pressing against his consciousness. After nearly an hour of careful excavation, Kael found what he was looking for: a stone archway carved with intertwining dragons, their eyes set with gems that still glowed faintly with protective magic. The passage beyond was dark and narrow, but the enchantments that had preserved it were still functioning after 5 centuries. "I'll wait here," Pyraxis said, settling her massive form among the ruins. "The passages were built for humans, not dragons. But be careful, young guardian. The knowledge you seek may carry a price you're not prepared to pay." Kael activated the light crystal on his staff and stepped into the passage, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down around him. The walls were lined with murals depicting the history of the Dragon Riders, from their founding during the Age of Wonders to their final battle against the Void Wraiths. Each image told a story of sacrifice and heroism, but also of failure and loss. The archive sanctum lay at the heart of the underground complex, a circular chamber with walls that stretched up into darkness. Shelves carved directly from the living rock held thousands of scrolls, books, and crystal memory stones, all protected by preservation spells that had kept them intact through the centuries of war and neglect above. But it was the central pedestal that drew Kael's attention, where a single tome bound in dragon scales rested beneath a dome of crystallized light. The Book of Endings, his grandfather had called it, the collection of prophecies and warnings left by the first Dragon Riders for their successors. Kael approached the pedestal with reverence, knowing that he was likely the first person to enter this chamber since the fall of Drakmoor. The protective dome recognized his dragon bond and dissolved at his touch, allowing him to lift the ancient tome with hands that trembled slightly. The pages were made from a material that felt like silk but was stronger than steel, inscribed with text that seemed to shift and change as he read it. The prophecies were written in the Old Tongue, the formal language of the Dragon Riders, but Kael's education had included extensive study of the ancient texts. "When shadow rises from the depths below," he read aloud, his voice echoing in the empty chamber, "and kingdoms war while darkness grows, the last guardian shall stand alone, to unite the crowns or see hope overthrown." The words sent a chill through Kael's bones, their relevance to his current situation unmistakable. But as he continued reading, the prophecies became more specific and more disturbing. 5 realms shall stand in bitter strife, while ancient hunger feeds on life. But one among the royal 5 serves darkness with his mortal life, and through his lies the kingdoms fall, unless the guardian heeds the call. A traitor among the rulers, just as Kael had suspected. But the prophecy offered no clues about which of the 5 monarchs had been corrupted, or how long they had been serving the Void Wraiths. The betrayal could have been going on for years, decades even, with the traitor subtly manipulating events to keep the kingdoms divided and weakened. Kael turned the page and found a detailed description of the Void Wraiths themselves, written by dragon riders who had faced them in battle. The ancient enemy was not simply a collection of shadow creatures, but a hive mind of pure hunger that existed in the spaces between realities. They fed on negative emotions, growing stronger with each act of hatred, despair, or violence committed in the mortal world. The wraiths cannot be destroyed by sword or spell, the text continued, for they are absence itself, the negation of existence. Only through unity of purpose and purity of intent can they be banished, and only then at great cost to those who would stand against them. The final passages of the prophecy section dealt with the specific requirements for defeating the Void Wraiths, and what Kael read there made his heart sink. The ancient seals that bound the creatures could only be renewed through a ritual that required the willing sacrifice of a dragon and rider pair, their life force used to strengthen the barriers between worlds. The last guardian must choose the path, the prophecy concluded, between the world's salvation and his dragon's wrath. For in the end, when all seems lost, victory comes only at the greatest cost. Kael closed the book with shaking hands, the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The prophecies made it clear that defeating the Void Wraiths would require not just unity among the kingdoms, but the ultimate sacrifice from him and Pyraxis. They would have to give their lives to save a world that barely remembered their order existed. But first, he had to find a way to unite the five kingdoms despite the traitor working against him. The prophecies offered some guidance there as well, speaking of signs and portents that would reveal the truth to those wise enough to see them. Kael spent the next several hours studying the other texts in the archive, learning about the nature of dragon bonds, the history of the Void Wraith Wars, and the techniques that had been used to identify and counter void corruption. The knowledge was invaluable, but it also painted a picture of just how desperate their situation had become. When he finally emerged from the underground passages, the sun was setting, and Pyraxis was waiting with obvious concern. The great dragon's eyes reflected the orange light of dusk as she studied Kael's expression. "You found what you were looking for," she observed, though her mental voice carried notes of sorrow. "And you learned the price that must be paid." Kael nodded, unable to speak for a moment as he processed everything he had discovered. The prophecies had confirmed his worst fears, while also providing a glimmer of hope. Unity was possible, but only if he could identify and neutralize the traitor before the Void Wraiths broke free completely. "The prophecies speak of signs that will reveal the betrayer," Kael said finally. "Corruption that cannot be hidden when the ancient enemy grows strong enough. We need to watch the rulers carefully, look for evidence of void influence." Pyraxis was quiet for a long moment, her ancient mind working through the implications. "And if we identify the traitor? What then? Accusations without proof will only drive the kingdoms further apart. Then we'll have to find proof," Kael replied, his voice carrying a determination that surprised even him. "The prophecies also speak of artifacts that can reveal void corruption, relics from the First War that were hidden throughout the kingdoms. If we can find them, we might be able to expose the traitor and convince the others of the threat." As they prepared to leave the ruins of Aethermoor, Kael took one last look at the shattered remains of what had once been the greatest center of learning in the known world. The dragon riders who had built this place had faced the same impossible odds, the same seemingly hopeless task of uniting a divided world against an ancient enemy. They had failed, but their sacrifice had bought 5 centuries of peace. Now it was Kael's turn to face the darkness. Armed with their knowledge and their warnings, but ultimately alone except for his dragon companion. "Where do we go now?" Pyraxis asked, as she spread her great wings for flight. Kael thought about the prophecies, about the signs and portents that would reveal the truth. The Void Wraiths were growing stronger, which meant their influence on the traitor would be harder to hide. If he watched carefully, if he knew what to look for, he might be able to identify which of the 5 rulers served the darkness. "Back to the kingdoms," he said, climbing onto Pyraxis's back. "But this time, we're not just seeking alliance, we're hunting a traitor." As they rose into the darkening sky, Kael felt the weight of ancient prophecy pressing down on him. The last guardian, standing alone against the darkness, with only his dying dragon and his desperate hope to light the way forward. The real battle was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Ice Queen's Gambit. The Frostspire Citadel rose from the northern icefields like a crystalline mountain, its towers carved from living glacier and reinforced with magic that had kept it standing for 1,000 years. Kael approached on Pyraxis's back through a snowstorm that seemed to part before Queen Liana's will, the very weather bending to serve the Ice Realm's needs. "She knows we're coming," Pyraxis observed, her breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. The storm is natural, but it's being guided. Liana wants to demonstrate her power before we even land. Kael pulled his dragon-scale cloak tighter as they descended toward the Citadel's landing platform, a broad expanse of ice that had been smoothed to mirror perfection. Ice Guard soldiers in crystalline armor stood at attention, their breath creating small clouds in the Arctic air as they watched the dragons approach with professional interest rather than fear. Queen Liana herself waited at the platform's edge, her silver hair whipping in the wind and her ice-blue eyes fixed on Kael with calculating intensity. She wore robes of white and silver that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light, and a crown of crystallized frost that caught and reflected the pale northern sun. "Dragon Rider," she said as Kael dismounted, her voice carrying clearly despite the wind. "You return to my realm with more warnings of ancient threats, I assume?" "Your Majesty," Kael replied with a formal bow. "I come with proof of those threats, and a proposal that might benefit both your kingdom and the world." Liana's expression remained skeptical, but she gestured for him to follow her into the citadel. "Very well. But I warn you, my patience for prophecies and ancient myths grows thin. My people face real dangers that require immediate attention." As they walked through corridors lined with ice sculptures that seemed to move in the corner of one's eye, Kael noticed the signs of strain that the ongoing wars had placed on the ice realm. Soldiers bore fresh wounds, and the magical defenses that protected the citadel hummed with the constant energy required to maintain them against siege weapons and earth magic. That the throne room was a marvel of ice architecture, with walls that rose in sweeping curves to support a dome of crystallized aurora light. The throne itself was carved from a single massive ice crystal, its surface etched with runes that pulsed with cold fire. "Speak your piece, Dragon Rider," Liana said as she settled onto her throne, her posture regal but alert. "What proof do you offer of these Void Wraiths you claim threaten us all?" Kael had prepared for this moment during his flight north, knowing that he would need more than words to convince the pragmatic queen. He reached into his pack and withdrew a crystal vial containing a sample of the void corruption he had collected from the ruins of Aethermoor. "This is what remains when the Void Wraiths feed," he said, holding up the vial so that Liana could see the writhing darkness within. "It's not simply shadow or absence of light, it's the negation of existence itself, reality consumed and transformed into hunger." Liana leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the unnatural darkness that seemed to move independently within the crystal container. Even through the protective barriers of the vial, the corruption radiated a wrongness that made the ice sculptures in the throne room seem to recoil. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice sharp with sudden concern. "The Central Wastelands, in the ruins of the old Dragon Rider strongholds," Kael replied. "The corruption is spreading, growing stronger with each passing day. And Your Majesty, it's not random. The Void Wraiths are testing the ancient seals at specific locations, probing for weaknesses." Kael produced a map marked with the locations where he had detected void activity, spreading it across the floor before Liana's throne. The pattern was clear to anyone with strategic training. The corruption was concentrated along the northern borders of the Ice Realm, where the original sealing sites had been established. "If the Void Wraiths break through anywhere first, it will be here," Kael continued. "Your kingdom stands directly above some of the most important binding points. When they escape, your people will be the first to face their hunger." Liana studied the map with the analytical mind that had made her one of the most effective rulers in Aethermoor's history. She could see the implications immediately, the strategic nightmare of facing an enemy that fed on conflict itself while surrounded by hostile neighbors. "Even if I accept your warnings as truth," she said slowly, "what would you have me do? My kingdom is already under siege by Magnus's mountain warriors. I cannot simply abandon our defenses to chase shadows in the wasteland." "You don't have to abandon anything," Kael said, his voice carrying the urgency of desperation. "But you do need allies. The ancient texts are clear. The Void Wraiths can only be defeated by united kingdoms, their combined magical traditions working in harmony rather than opposition." Liana's laugh was like the sound of ice cracking. "Unity? Dragon Rider? You ask for the impossible. The mountain kingdoms have been raiding our borders for 3 years. The desert principalities steal our trade routes, while the forest clans harbor our enemies. 5 centuries of grievances cannot be set aside because of ancient prophecies." "They can if the alternative is extinction," Kael replied. "Your Majesty, I've studied the historical records. Every time the kingdoms have faced existential threats, they've found ways to cooperate. The Demon Wars, the Plague of Shadows, the Dragon Rebellion's unity was achieved because the cost of division was too high to bear." Before Liana could respond, a commotion erupted in the corridors outside the throne room. Shouts of alarm and the sound of running feet echoed through the crystalline halls, followed by the distinctive howl that Kael had learned to associate with Void Wraith activity. "Your Majesty," An Ice Guard captain burst into the throne room, his crystalline armor cracked and his face pale with terror. The northern watchtower is under attack by things that shouldn't exist. Shadows that move without light, creatures that drain the warmth from everything they touch. Lyanna was on her feet instantly, her royal composure replaced by the focused intensity of a military commander. How many? What are their capabilities? Unknown, Your Majesty. Our scouts report that conventional weapons pass through them without effect, and ice magic seems to make them stronger rather than weaker. Captain Frostblade requests immediate reinforcement. Kael felt his blood turn to ice as he realized what was happening. The Void Wraiths weren't just testing the seals anymore. They were making limited incursions into the mortal world, probing the defenses of the kingdoms that stood above their prison. Your Majesty, he said, urgently. This is exactly what I warned you about. The Void Wraiths are beginning to break through, and conventional military tactics won't stop them. You need dragon fire and the ancient binding techniques to drive them back. Lyanna looked between Kael and her captain, her strategic mind weighing options and calculating risks. The attack on her northern border was real and immediate, but accepting help from the Dragon Rider would mean acknowledging the truth of his warnings about ancient threats. Can you stop these creatures? She asked Kael directly. Pyraxis and I can drive them back temporarily, Kael replied. But without the proper sealing rituals, they'll just return stronger than before. And Your Majesty, this is only the beginning. The incursions will become more frequent and more powerful until the seals fail completely. Lyanna made her decision with the swift certainty that had kept her kingdom strong through years of warfare. Captain, prepare a strike force to accompany the Dragon Rider to the northern watchtower. Full magical support, but be prepared to withdraw if conventional tactics prove ineffective. As the Ice Guard mobilized with practiced efficiency, Lyanna turned back to Kael with an expression that mixed determination with deep concern. Dragon Rider, if you can help us drive back this threat, I will consider your proposals for alliance. But understand that trust must be earned through action, not words. Kael nodded, understanding that this would be his first real chance to prove that the ancient threats were real, and that Dragon Rider knowledge was still relevant in the modern world. As he prepared to face Void Wraiths in actual combat for the first time, he felt the weight of prophecy pressing down on him. The battle for Aethermoor's future was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether he could prove that unity was not just possible, but essential for survival. Come, Pyraxis, he called as he strode toward the Citadel's landing platform. It's time to show them what dragonfire can do against the darkness. The great dragon's roar of challenge echoed across the ice fields, a sound of defiance that had not been heard in the Northern Realm for over a century. The last guardian was going to war. Chapter 5. Desert Winds and Mountain Stone. The Sun Spear. Oasis shimmered like a jewel in the vast expanse of the southern desert. Its palm trees and crystal-clear springs, a welcome sight after days of flying over endless dunes. Kael guided Pyraxis down toward the trading post that served as neutral ground between the desert principalities and the mountain kingdoms, hoping that the shared commercial interests might provide common ground for his diplomatic efforts. The success at the Ice Realm's northern watchtower had given him credibility with Queen Lyanna, but it had also revealed how quickly the Void Wraith incursions were escalating. The shadow creatures had been driven back by dragonfire and ancient binding techniques, but their very presence proved that the seals were failing faster than anyone had anticipated. Prince Rashid al-Sahra was already waiting at the oasis, his elaborate robes of gold and crimson a stark contrast to the practical desert gear worn by his guards. The desert prince was a tall man with dark skin weathered by years under the harsh sun, his bearing confident and his eyes sharp with intelligence. Beside him stood King Magnus Ironhold, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the desert heat despite the magical cooling enchantments woven into his mountain-forged armor. Dragon Rider, Rashid called out as Kael dismounted, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of desert hospitality. Your message spoke of urgent matters that concern both our realms. I confess curiosity about what could unite the interests of sand and stone. Magnus grunted his agreement, wiping sweat from his brow despite the enchantments. This had better be worth the journey, Dragonheart. My kingdom faces real threats that require my immediate attention. Kael had chosen this meeting place carefully, knowing that both rulers had legitimate grievances against each other, but also shared interests in the trade routes that passed through the oasis. If he could demonstrate the Void Wraith threat in a way that affected their mutual concerns, he might be able to crack the wall of mistrust between them. Your Majesties, Kael began, spreading a map on the table beneath the oasis's largest palm tree. The threat I warned you about is no longer theoretical. 3 days ago, Void Wraiths broke through the ancient seals and attacked Queen Lyanna's northern watchtower. They were driven back, but the incursion proves that the barriers are failing. Rashid studied the map with the analytical mind that had made him the most successful trader prince in the desert kingdoms. You speak of these shadow creatures as if they were a natural phenomenon, Dragon Rider. But the old stories describe them as beings of pure malevolence, entities that exist only to consume and destroy. The old stories are accurate, Kael replied grimly. The Void Wraiths feed on negative emotions, growing stronger with each act of hatred, violence, or despair. The wars between your kingdoms have been nourishing them for decades, giving them the power they need to break free from their ancient prison. Magnus slammed his fist on the table, his patience finally exhausted. Enough of this mystical nonsense! You ask us to ignore real injuries and legitimate grievances because of ancient fairy tales. The desert principalities have been raiding our mining convoys for months, stealing ore that belongs to the mountain kingdoms by right of conquest. Conquest? Rashid's voice carried the dangerous edge of controlled anger. Your people strip mine the sacred peaks, poisoning the underground streams that feed our oases. We take only what is necessary to protect our water sources from your industrial greed. Kael watched the familiar pattern of accusation and counter-accusation, seeing how easily the two rulers fell into the cycle of hatred that had defined their relationship for years. But he also noticed something else. The shadows beneath the palm trees seemed deeper than they should be, and the temperature was dropping despite the desert sun overhead. Your Majesties, Kael said urgently, his hand moving to the dragon-forged sword at his side. We need to continue this discussion elsewhere. The Void Wraiths are drawn to conflict, and your anger is calling them here. Both rulers looked at him with expressions of disbelief, but their skepticism turned to alarm as the shadows began to writhe and move independently of their sources. The crystal-clear springs of the oasis turned black as void corruption seeped up from the depths, and the palm trees began to wither as their life force was drained away. Impossible. Magnus breathed, his hand instinctively reaching for his warhammer as the temperature plummeted. This is just a desert oasis, not some cursed battlefield. The Void Wraiths don't care about geography. Kael replied, drawing his sword as the first shadow creatures began to materialize from the corrupted darkness. They go wherever they can feed, and right now your hatred is providing them with a feast. The shadow creatures that emerged from the void corruption were unlike anything the two rulers had ever faced. They moved like liquid darkness given form, their shapes constantly shifting between humanoid figures and abstract geometries of hunger. Where they touched the ground, plants withered and died, and the very air seemed to grow thin and cold. Rashid raised his hands and called upon the sun magic that was his birthright, sending streams of golden fire toward the nearest void wraith. But instead of burning the creature, the magical energy seemed to be absorbed and transformed, making the shadow being larger and more substantial. Traditional magic feeds them, Kael shouted, over the sound of Pyraxis's roar as the great dragon landed in the oasis clearing. You need to work together, combine your abilities in ways that create harmony rather than conflict. Magnus hefted his enchanted warhammer and charged toward a cluster of shadow creatures, his earth magic causing stone barriers to rise from the desert floor. But the Void Wraiths simply flowed around his defenses like water, their touch draining the magical energy from his protective spells. This is madness, the Mountain King growled as he was forced to retreat. How do you fight something that has no physical form? With unity, Kael replied, his dragon-forged blade cutting through a Void Wraith in a burst of silver fire. The ancient texts speak of harmony magic, the combination of different elemental traditions to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Pyraxis breathed a stream of dragon fire that drove back several shadow creatures, but even her ancient power was limited against enemies that existed partially outside normal reality. The great dragon's mental voice carried urgency as she communicated with Kael through their bond. There are too many of them, she warned. The corruption is spreading faster than we can contain it. If these two don't learn to cooperate quickly, the oasis will become a permanent breach point. Kael looked between Rashid and Magnus, seeing the fear and confusion in their eyes, as they faced an enemy that defied everything they understood about warfare and magic. But he also saw something else, the beginning of mutual respect, as they realized that their individual powers were insufficient against the Void Wraith threat. Prince Rashid, Kael called out, your sun magic can purify corruption, but only if it's channeled through earth magic to give it substance. King Magnus, your stone barriers can contain the shadow creatures, but only if they're reinforced with solar energy to prevent void absorption. For a moment, both rulers hesitated, their centuries of mistrust warring with the immediate need for survival. Then Rashid extended his hand toward Magnus, golden fire dancing around his fingers. Mountain King, the Desert Prince said formally, I offer you the light of the eternal sun to strengthen your stone against the darkness. Magnus stared at the offered hand for a heartbeat, then grasped it firmly with his own earth-stained fingers. "And I offer you the strength of the eternal mountains to give your light form and purpose." The moment their hands touched, something extraordinary happened. The golden fire of sun magic merged with the steady power of earth magic, creating a new form of energy that pulsed with harmonious light. The combined magic flowed outward from their joined hands, washing over the corrupted oasis like a cleansing tide. The Void Wraiths recoiled from the harmony magic as if it were poison, their forms becoming less substantial as the unified energy disrupted their ability to feed on conflict and hatred. The shadow creatures let out sounds of frustration and hunger, before dissolving back into the depths from which they had emerged. As the last of the corruption faded from the oasis, the springs ran clear again, and the palm trees began to show signs of renewed life. Rashid and Magnus stood together, still holding hands, both staring in amazement at what they had accomplished through cooperation. "By the sacred peaks," Magnus whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "I've never felt magic like that before. It was as if our powers were meant to work together." Rashid nodded slowly, his analytical mind processing the implications of what had just occurred. The ancient texts speak of the Age of Harmony, when all the kingdoms worked together and magic flowed like rivers between the realms. "I thought it was merely legend." "It was real," Kael said, sheathing his sword as Pyraxis settled beside him with obvious relief. "And it's the only way to defeat the Void Wraiths permanently. Individual magic feeds them, but harmony magic disrupts their very nature." The two rulers looked at each other with new understanding, the hatred and mistrust of years beginning to crack under the weight of shared experience. They had faced an impossible enemy together, and discovered that their combined strength was greater than either could achieve alone. "Dragon Rider," Rashid said slowly, "if what you say is true, if these Void Wraiths truly threaten all our kingdoms, then perhaps it is time to set aside old grievances in favor of new alliances." Magnus nodded reluctantly, his practical mind recognizing the strategic necessity even as his pride rebelled against admitting error. "The mountain clans have always valued strength above all else. What we accomplished here today, that was true strength." Kael felt a surge of hope as he realized that the first real crack had appeared in the wall of hatred that divided the kingdoms. The Void Wraith attack had been terrifying, but it had also provided undeniable proof of both the threat and the solution. "This is only the beginning," he warned them. "The incursions will become more frequent and more powerful as the ancient seals continue to weaken. But if we can unite all 5 kingdoms, if we can teach them to work together as you just did, we might have a chance to renew the bindings and push the Void Wraiths back into the depths." As the sun set over the restored oasis, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, 3 unlikely allies began planning for a war that would determine the fate of all Aethermoor. The first alliance had been forged in the crucible of shared danger, but Kael knew that the hardest battles still lay ahead. Somewhere among the 5 kingdoms was a traitor who served the darkness, and until that betrayer was identified and neutralized, every alliance would remain fragile and every victory temporary. But for the first time since discovering the void corruption in the central wastelands, Kael allowed himself to hope that unity might actually be possible. Chapter 6. Forest Wisdom and Growing Shadows. The Heartwood Grove stood at the center of the Eastern Forest Clan's territory, its ancient trees reaching toward the sky like living pillars that supported the very heavens. Kael approached on Pyraxis's back through a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor, where Elder Theron Oakenheart waited among trees that had been old when the Dragon Riders first walked the world. The forest elder was a tall, lean man whose bark-like skin and green eyes spoke of decades spent in communion with the natural world. His robes seemed to be woven from living wood and leaves, shifting and changing with the seasons and his moods. Around him, the trees themselves leaned inward as if listening to an unheard conversation. "Dragon Rider," Theron said as Kael dismounted, his voice carrying the rustle of wind through leaves. "The forest whispers of your recent victories, of shadow creatures driven back by harmony magic. The trees remember when such cooperation was common rather than miraculous." Kael bowed respectfully to the elder, knowing that the forest clans maintained the longest memories and the deepest knowledge of any kingdom in Aethermoor. If anyone could provide insight into the Void Wraith threat and the traitor mentioned in the prophecies, it would be Theron. "Elder Theron," Kael replied, "I come seeking the wisdom of the forest and the knowledge preserved in your living archives. The Void Wraiths grow stronger with each passing day, and I fear we have little time left before they break free completely." Theron nodded gravely, gesturing for Kael to follow him deeper into the grove where the oldest trees grew. "Come then, young guardian. The Heartwood Archive holds memories that stretch back to the first war against the Shadow Hunger. But be warned, some knowledge carries a price that may be higher than you wish to pay." As they walked between trees whose trunks were wider than houses, Kael noticed that the forest itself seemed to be responding to their presence. Branches moved to create clearer paths, flowers bloomed out of season to provide light, and the very air hummed with natural magic that felt different from the elemental powers of the other kingdoms. The forest remembers everything, Theron explained, placing his hand on the bark of a massive oak whose trunk bore spiral patterns that seemed to shift and flow. Every battle, every alliance, every betrayal is recorded in the rings of growth, preserved for those who know how to read the living text. The tree responded to Theron's touch by opening a hollow in its trunk, revealing a chamber lined with crystallized sap that glowed with soft green light. Within the chamber, images began to form, not static pictures but living memories that played out like scenes from history. The Void Wraiths are not simply creatures of darkness, Theron said as the images showed the first war against the ancient enemy. They are the antithesis of life itself, beings that exist in the spaces between existence and nothingness. They feed on negative emotions because such feelings create cracks in the fabric of reality, weak points where they can insert their influence. Kael watched in fascination as the tree's memories showed dragon riders and forest mages working together to create the original sealing rituals. The magic they used was unlike anything he had seen before, not the raw elemental power of individual kingdoms, but a weaving of all 5 traditions into something that transcended their separate limitations. The Great Harmony, Theron continued, his voice heavy with ancient sorrow. 5 kingdoms, 5 magical traditions, united in purpose and bound by trust. It was the only force powerful enough to banish the Void Wraiths to the depths beneath the world. But the alliance didn't last, Kael observed, seeing how the images showed the gradual breakdown of cooperation after the victory. The kingdoms turned against each other, and eventually against the dragon riders themselves. Fear, Theron said simply. Fear of the power that unity had created, fear that one kingdom might dominate the others, fear that the dragon riders had become too influential. The very success of the Great Harmony became the seed of its destruction. The tree's memories shifted to show more recent events, and Kael's blood ran cold as he saw familiar faces among the images. The 5 current rulers appeared in scenes spanning decades, their interactions carefully recorded by the forest's patient observation. You've been watching them, Kael realized. The forest has been monitoring the kingdoms, tracking their conflicts and alliances. The trees see all and forget nothing, Theron confirmed. We have watched the gradual escalation of conflicts, the careful manipulation of grievances, the subtle poisoning of relationships that might have led to cooperation. Manipulation? Kael leaned forward, his attention sharpening. You mean someone has been deliberately stoking the wars between the kingdoms? Theron's expression grew troubled as he guided the tree's memories to focus on specific incidents over the past several years. Observe carefully, Dragon Rider. See how conflicts that should have been resolved through negotiation instead escalated to violence. Notice how peace overtures were sabotaged by convenient accidents and misunderstandings. Kael studied the flowing images with growing alarm, seeing a pattern of manipulation that stretched back decades. Trade negotiations disrupted by mysterious raids, diplomatic marriages prevented by sudden scandals, peace treaties undermined by strategic assassinations that were blamed on rival kingdoms. Someone has been orchestrating the conflicts, Kael said, his voice tight with anger, playing the kingdoms against each other, ensuring that they remain divided and weak. More than that, Theron replied grimly. Someone has been feeding the Void Wraiths deliberately, using the wars to nourish the ancient enemy and weaken the seals that bind them. This is not mere political manipulation, it is active collaboration with the forces of darkness. The implications hit Kael like a physical blow. The traitor mentioned in the prophecies wasn't just someone who had been corrupted by Void influence. They were an active agent who had been working for decades to ensure the Void Wraiths' return. Can you identify them? Kael asked urgently. Do the forest memories show which of the rulers is the betrayer? Theron's expression grew even more troubled as he manipulated the tree's memories, searching through decades of recorded observations. That is the most disturbing aspect of what we have witnessed. The manipulation has been too subtle, too carefully orchestrated to be the work of any single individual. It suggests either a conspiracy involving multiple rulers, or what? Kael demanded. Or someone with the ability to influence all 5 kingdoms simultaneously. Someone with access to the highest levels of power in each realm. Theron paused, his green eyes reflecting deep concern. Dragon Rider? There is something else you must know. The forest memories show increasing void corruption in all 5 kingdoms. But the pattern is wrong. Wrong how? Void corruption should be strongest near the ancient seal sites, gradually weakening with distance. But what we observe is the opposite. The corruption is strongest in the political centers of each kingdom, in the places where the rulers make their decisions. Kael felt ice forming in his veins as he understood the implications. The traitor isn't just serving the Void Wraiths. They're actively spreading corruption through the kingdom leadership structures.
Worse than that,
Theron said, Widro. The corruption patterns suggest that the betrayer has been using void magic to influence the other rulers, subtly poisoning their thoughts and amplifying their negative emotions. The wars between the kingdoms may not be entirely natural. They may be the result of supernatural manipulation. The revelation changed everything Castle thought he knew about the situation. If the rulers were being influenced by void corruption, then their hatred and mistrust might not be entirely their own fault. But it also meant that identifying the traitor would be even more difficult, since all 5 rulers would show signs of void influence. Is there a way to detect the source of the corruption? Kael asked. Some method to identify who is spreading the influence versus who is merely affected by it? Theron was quiet for a long moment, consulting memories that stretched back centuries. The ancient texts speak of artifacts created during the First War, relics designed to reveal void corruption and protect against its influence. But most were lost when the Dragon Rider strongholds fell. Most, but not all. The Heartstone of Truth was hidden here in the forest when the last Dragon Riders realized their order was doomed. It has the power to reveal the true nature of any being, stripping away illusions and deceptions to show what lies beneath. Kael's heart leaped with hope. Where is it? Can we retrieve it? It lies in the Deepwood Sanctum, protected by trials that test the worthiness of those who would claim it. But Dragon Rider, you must understand, using the Heartstone will reveal the traitor, but it will also expose them to you. Once they know they have been discovered, they will act with desperate violence to protect their secret. Then we'll have to be ready for that. Kael said grimly. How long will it take to reach the sanctum and retrieve the Heartstone? If you leave immediately and Pyraxis flies at her best speed, you could return within 2 days. But Kael, Theron's expression grew deeply troubled. The forest whispers of gathering darkness, of void incursions increasing in frequency and power. I fear that time is running shorter than any of us realized. As if summoned by his words, a sound echoed through the forest that made every tree shudder. The howl of Void Wraiths, but louder and more coordinated than Kael had ever heard before. The ancient enemy was no longer just testing the seals. They were preparing for a major assault. Go, Theron urged, his bark-like skin taking on a grayish tinge as void corruption began seeping up from the forest floor. Retrieve the Heartstone and identify the traitor before it's too late. The forest will hold the corruption as long as possible, but even our deepest roots cannot resist the void hunger forever. Kael ran toward where Pyraxis waited, his mind racing with the implications of what he had learned. The traitor wasn't just a corrupted ruler, they were an active agent of the Void Wraiths who had been manipulating events for decades. And now, with the seals failing rapidly, they were preparing to complete their works. As Pyraxis launched into the sky, carrying Kael toward the Deepwood Sanctum and the artifact that might save them all, the Dragon Rider couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against time itself. The final battle was approaching, and everything would depend on whether they could identify and stop the betrayer before the Void Wraiths broke free completely. Behind them, the Heartwood Grove began to darken as shadows that had no source spread through the ancient trees, and Elder Theron prepared to make his own stand against the growing darkness. Chapter 7. The Traitor Revealed. The Heartstone of Truth pulsed with ancient power in Kael's hands as he approached the emergency summit he had called at the neutral ground of Thornpass Valley. The artifact was a crystal sphere the size of a human heart, its surface swirling with opalescent light that seemed to see into the very soul of anyone who looked upon it. Retrieving it from the Deepwood Sanctum had cost him precious time, but the trials had deemed him worthy, and now he possessed the one tool that could reveal the traitor among the 5 rulers. All 5 monarchs had answered his urgent summons, though their reasons varied. Queen Liana came because she had seen the Void Wraiths firsthand and understood the threat. Prince Rashid and King Magnus attended because their shared experience at the Oasis had convinced them that cooperation was necessary. Elder Theron arrived despite the growing corruption in his forest realm, his bark-like features showing the strain of holding back the void influence. But it was the 5th ruler who concerned Kael most. Lord Malachar of the Western Borderlands, a kingdom that controlled the mountain passes between the other realms. Malachar was a man of middle years with unremarkable features and a quiet demeanor that had always made him seem like the least threatening of the 5 rules. But as Kael studied him with the enhanced perception granted by carrying the Heartstone, he began to notice subtle wrongness in the man's presence. Dragon Rider, Malachar said as the 5 rulers gathered in the pavilion that had been erected for the summit. Your message spoke of urgent revelations about the Void Wraith threat. I confess I remain skeptical about these ancient dangers, but recent disturbances in my realm have given me cause for concern. Kael noted how Malachar's voice carried just the right note of reluctant cooperation, how his expression showed appropriate concern mixed with healthy skepticism. It was a perfect performance, but the Heartstone's influence allowed Kael to see the calculation behind every gesture, the careful manipulation of every word. Your Majesties, Kael began, his hand resting on the concealed Heartstone. I have discovered that the Void Wraith threat is far worse than any of us realized. The ancient enemy has not been simply waiting in the depths, they have been actively working to ensure their return through an agent among us. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Liana's eyes sharpened with strategic interest, Rashid and Magnus exchanged glances of concern, and Theron's expression grew deeply troubled. But Malakar's response was the most telling, a flash of something cold and alien behind his eyes before his mask of concern reasserted itself. An agent? Liana asked sharply. You mean a traitor among the kingdoms? More than that, Kael replied, watching Malakar carefully. Someone who has been manipulating events for decades, orchestrating the wars between our realms to feed the Void Wraiths and weaken the ancient seals. Magnus slammed his fist on the table, his face flushing with anger. Impossible. The conflicts between our kingdoms are based on legitimate grievances, real injuries that demand justice. Are they? Kael challenged, pulling out the evidence he had gathered from the forest archives. Elder Theron's records show a pattern of manipulation spanning 50 years. Trade negotiations sabotaged by convenient raids, peace overtures destroyed by mysterious accidents, diplomatic marriages prevented by sudden scandals. As Kael spread the documentation across the table, he watched each ruler's reaction carefully. Liana studied the evidence with analytical precision. Rashid's expression grew increasingly troubled as he recognized incidents from his own kingdom's history. Magnus looked confused and angry, and Theron nodded grimly as his suspicions were confirmed. But Malakar's reaction was different. His eyes moved across the documents with the familiarity of someone who already knew what they contained, and Kael caught a brief flash of satisfaction before the Borderland Lord's expression shifted to appropriate shock and concern. This is disturbing, Malakar said, his voice carrying perfect notes of concern and indignation. If someone has truly been manipulating our conflicts, they must be found and brought to justice. But how can we be certain these documents are authentic? How do we know this isn't simply another attempt at manipulation? It was a clever response, designed to cast doubt on the evidence while appearing to support the investigation. But the Heartstone's influence allowed Kael to see the void corruption that clung to Malakar like a second shadow, invisible to normal sight but unmistakable to enhanced perception. You raise an excellent point, Lord Malakar, Kael said, his hand moving to fully grasp the Heartstone. Which is why I brought this. He pulled the artifact from its concealment, and the reaction was immediate and dramatic. The crystal sphere blazed with opalescent light that filled the pavilion, and suddenly everyone present could see what Kael had been seeing, the true nature of those around them. Liana appeared exactly as she was, her ice-blue aura reflecting her straightforward nature and genuine concern for her people. Rashid glowed with golden light that spoke of honor and wisdom, while Magnus radiated the steady brown energy of earth and stone. Theron's aura was green and growing, connected to the natural world through roots of living light. But Malakar's true nature was revealed in all its horror. The void corruption that had been hidden beneath his human appearance blazed forth like a wound in reality itself. His form flickered between human and something else, a writhing mass of shadow and hunger that wore flesh like a disguise. The wrongness of his presence was so intense that several of the rulers stepped back in instinctive revulsion. Impossible, Malakar snarled, his voice now carrying harmonics that hurt to hear. The Heartstone was destroyed centuries ago. Hidden, not destroyed. Kael replied, raising his dragon-forged sword as void corruption began pouring from Malakar's form like smoke. Just as you've been hidden, feeding on our conflicts and preparing for your master's return. The thing that had been masquerading as Lord Malakar abandoned all pretense of humanity, its form expanding into a writhing mass of shadow and malevolent intelligence. Fools! You think you can stop what has been set in motion? The seals are already failing. The ancient hunger stirs in the depths, and soon all your petty kingdoms will be consumed. Void Wraiths began materializing throughout the pavilion, summoned by their agent's call. But these were different from the creatures Kael had faced before, larger, more substantial, and radiating an intelligence that spoke of direct connection to the ancient enemy's hive mind. The corruption has spread too far, the Malakar thing continued, its voice now a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Your rulers are already tainted, their minds poisoned by decades of void influence. Even if you destroy me, the damage is done. Liana raised her hands and called upon her ice magic, but the frozen barriers she created were immediately consumed by the void creatures. My magic isn't working properly, she called out in alarm. Something is interfering with my connection to the elemental forces. The void corruption. Theron explained grimly as his own nature magic flickered and failed. It's been building in all our kingdoms for years, weakening our magical traditions from within. Kael realized with growing horror that the traitor's plan had been even more insidious than he had imagined. By spreading void corruption through all 5 kingdoms, Malachar had not only fed the ancient enemy but also weakened the very magical traditions that would be needed to renew the seals. Pyraxis. Kael called out through their bond, and the great dragon's roar answered from outside the pavilion. But even as his companion prepared to join the battle, Kael could sense that dragon fire alone would not be enough against so many void creatures. You cannot win, the Malachar thing taunted as more Void Wraiths poured into the pavilion. The great harmony is broken, the magical traditions corrupted, and the ancient seals crumble with each passing moment. Soon the Void Lords themselves will walk the earth again, and all reality will be consumed. But as despair threatened to overwhelm the defenders, something unexpected happened. Rashid reached out and grasped Magnus's hand, just as they had done at the oasis, and their combined sun and earth magic blazed forth with purifying light. The harmony magic that resulted was weaker than before, tainted by the void corruption in their systems, but it was still enough to drive back several of the shadow creatures. The corruption weakens harmony magic but doesn't destroy it completely, Rashid called out, his voice tight with strain. If we can work together, we might still have a chance. Liana and Theron joined the circle, adding their ice and nature magic to the growing harmony. The combined power was still corrupted, still weaker than it should have been, but it created a barrier of light that held the Void Wraiths at bay. Impossible! The Malachar thing shrieked, its form becoming less stable as the harmony magic disrupted its connection to the void. The corruption should have made cooperation impossible. You should be tearing each other apart. You underestimated us, Kael said grimly, adding his own dragon-bonded power to the circle. Corruption can poison trust, but it cannot destroy the bonds forged in shared struggle. The Heartstone's light intensified, its purifying influence beginning to burn away the void corruption that had accumulated in the ruler's magical systems. Slowly, painfully, their true power began to reassert itself, and the harmony magic grew stronger and more stable. But even as the immediate threat was contained, Kael knew that this was only the beginning. The Malachar thing had been right about one crucial point. The ancient seals were failing, and somewhere in the depths beneath the world, the Void Lords were preparing to break free. The traitor had been revealed, and the first alliance forged. But the real battle for Aethermoor's survival was about to begin. Chapter 8. Shattered Trust and Desperate Alliance. The aftermath of Malachar's exposure left the 4 remaining rulers shaken and suspicious, their newfound unity fragile in the face of decades of manipulation. As the void corruption burned away under the Heartstone's purifying light, each monarch began to remember incidents and decisions that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now appeared tainted by supernatural influence. How long? Queen Liana asked, her voice tight with controlled fury, as she stared at the spot where the Malachar thing had been destroyed. How long has that creature been wearing a human face and poisoning our thoughts? Elder Theron consulted the forest memories that flowed through his consciousness. His bark-like features creased with concentration. The corruption patterns suggest at least 30 years, possibly longer. The real Lord Malachar may have been replaced decades ago, or he may have been gradually corrupted until nothing human remained. King Magnus slammed his fist against the pavilion's support post, his face flushed with rage and shame. 30 years of lies. 30 years of being manipulated like a puppet on strings. How many of my decisions were truly my own? How many of my people died because of that thing's influence? Prince Rashid placed a steadying hand on the Mountain King's shoulder, his own expression grim with understanding. We all bear that burden, my friend. The creature played us against each other with masterful skill, turning our legitimate concerns into weapons of division. Kael watched the rulers process their anger and guilt, knowing that this moment would determine whether the fragile alliance could survive the revelation of how thoroughly they had been deceived. The Heartstone's continued presence helped maintain clarity of thought, but it could not erase the emotional impact of learning that decades of conflict had been orchestrated by their enemy. The question now, Kael said carefully, is whether we can move forward together, despite what has been done to us. The Void Wraiths are still gathering strength, and the ancient seals continue to weaken. We have perhaps days before they break through completely. Liana turned her ice-blue gaze on him, her expression calculating. You speak of moving forward, Dragon Rider, but how can we trust each other when we don't even know which of our own thoughts are genuine? The corruption may be burned away, but its effects on our memories and decisions remain. It was a valid concern, and one that Kael had been wrestling with since the Heartstone's revelation. The void corruption had been subtle, working through amplified emotions and twisted perceptions rather than direct mind control. Separating genuine grievances from manufactured ones would be nearly impossible. Perhaps, Theron said slowly, his green eyes reflecting deep thought. The question is not whether our past conflicts were real, but whether our present cooperation can be genuine. The forest remembers that even in the age of harmony, the kingdoms had disagreements and competing interests. Unity does not require the absence of conflict, only the commitment to resolve differences through cooperation rather than warfare. Pyraxis's mental voice reached Kael through their bond, carrying urgent concern. The void incursions are accelerating, she warned. I can sense multiple breach points opening across all the kingdoms. Whatever we're going to do, it must be done quickly. Kael shared this information with the rulers, watching their expressions shift from introspection to immediate alarm. The luxury of processing their emotions would have to wait. The ancient enemy was not going to pause for their psychological recovery. How much time do we have? Rashid asked, his strategic mind already shifting to tactical considerations. Hours. Perhaps less. Kael replied grimly. The Malachar Thing's destruction has disrupted the coordination of the Void incursions, but it's also removed the last restraints on the Void Wraiths' emergence. They're going to break through in force, and when they do, individual kingdoms won't be able to stand against them. Maganas straightened his shoulders, his practical nature asserting itself in the face of immediate danger. Then we fight together or we fall separately. I've seen what harmony magic can accomplish. It's our only weapon against these shadow creatures. Agreed, Lyanna said, her royal authority cutting through the emotional turmoil. But we need more than just the four of us. This alliance must extend to our armies, our mages, our entire populations. Can harmony magic be taught quickly enough to make a difference? Theron nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. The forest archives contain the techniques used during the original war against the Void Wraiths. The magic can be taught, but it requires trust and cooperation between practitioners. Soldiers who have been fighting each other for years will struggle to work together effectively. Then we'll have to give them a reason to trust each other, Kael said, an idea beginning to form in his mind. The Heartstone doesn't just reveal corruption, it can also share truth and understanding between those who touch it simultaneously. If we can gather representatives from each kingdom's military and magical traditions, a dangerous gamble, Rashid observed. The Heartstone's revelations can be overwhelming. Some minds cannot handle the complete truth about themselves and others. More dangerous than facing the Void Wraiths with divided forces? Kael thought. We need unity of purpose, and that requires understanding. The Heartstone can provide that understanding, even if the process is painful. As they debated the risks and benefits of using the artifact to forge deeper cooperation, Pyraxis's warning proved prophetic. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble, and shadows started gathering in places where no shadows should exist. The void incursions were beginning in earnest. The decision is made for us, Lyanna said grimly, as void wraiths began materializing around the pavilion. We use the Heartstone now, or we face the darkness divided. The four rulers joined hands around the crystal sphere, and Kael placed his own hands on its surface to guide the process. The Heartstone's light blazed forth with blinding intensity, and suddenly each person in the circle could see and feel the other's true nature, their genuine motivations and deepest fears. Lyanna's fierce protectiveness for her people, her loneliness as a ruler who could never show weakness, her desperate hope that cooperation might finally bring peace to her war-torn realm. Magnus's pride in his craftsmen and miners, his guilt over the environmental damage caused by his kingdom's industries, his growing understanding that strength meant more than just military might. Rashid's love for the desert's harsh beauty, his struggle to balance tradition with necessary change, his vision of a future where the kingdom's different strengths complemented rather than competed with each other. Theron's deep connection to the natural world, his sorrow at watching the forests suffer from the kingdom's conflicts, his ancient wisdom that saw patterns and connections invisible to younger minds. And through it all, Kael's own nature was revealed. His burden as the last guardian, his fear that he would fail as his predecessors had failed. His growing realization that victory would require the ultimate sacrifice that the prophecies had foretold. The shared understanding created by the Heartstone's influence was overwhelming. But it also forged bonds of empathy and trust that no amount of void corruption could break. When the light faded, the four rulers looked at each other with new eyes, seeing not enemies or rivals but fellow guardians of their people's future. Now I understand, Magnus said quietly, his voice heavy with emotion. The mountain clans have always valued strength, but I see now that true strength comes from unity, not dominance. And I see that the desert's independence need not mean isolation, Rashid added. Our different traditions can work together without losing their unique character. Leanna nodded, her ice-blue eyes bright with unshed tears. The ice teaches patience and endurance, but it also teaches that even the hardest barriers can be melted by sufficient warmth. Perhaps it's time to let the walls between our kingdoms thaw. Theron's smile was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The forest remembers when all the kingdoms were one people, before borders and conflicts divided us. That unity can be restored, but only if we choose cooperation over competition. As the newly forged alliance prepared to face the growing void incursions, Kael felt a mixture of hope and dread. The unity they had achieved was real and powerful, but the prophecies were clear about the price that would be required to renew the ancient seals. Pyraxis's mental voice carried both pride and sorrow as she sensed his thoughts. The time approaches, young guardian. Are you prepared to pay the price that victory demands? Kael looked at the four rulers who had become his allies, thinking of all the people depending on their success. If it means saving them all, then yes. I'm ready. The final battle was about to begin, and with it, the ultimate test of whether unity and sacrifice could triumph over ancient hunger and eternal darkness. Chapter 9. The Battle for Aethermoor. The sky above the central wastelands had turned the color of old blood, torn by rifts that revealed the hungry darkness beyond reality's edge. From these wounds in the world, Void Wraiths poured forth in numbers that defied comprehension. Not the scattered creatures Kael had faced before, but an army of shadow and malevolence that stretched to the horizon. The united forces of the four kingdoms stood arrayed across the ancient battlefield where dragon riders had made their last stand 5 centuries ago. Ice Guard soldiers fought alongside Mountain Kingdom warriors, their crystalline armor gleaming next to bronze and steel. Desert cavalry rode in formation with Forest Clan rangers, their different fighting styles beginning to merge into something greater than the sum of their parts. But it was the magic that truly marked this battle as different from any fought before. Harmony magic flowed between the allied forces like rivers of light, ice magic merging with earth power, sunfire combining with nature's growth, creating effects that no single kingdom could have achieved alone. Kael rode Pyraxis above the battlefield, coordinating the defense while searching for the primary breach point where the Void Lords themselves would emerge. The great dragon's fire had evolved beyond simple flame, now burning with the combined essence of all 5 magical traditions as their bond deepened through shared purpose. There, Pyraxis said, her mental voice tight with strain as she maintained the harmony magic that flowed through their connection. The largest rift, where the old Starfall Tower once stood, the Void Lords are preparing to manifest. Kael could see it too. A tear in reality so vast that it seemed to swallow light itself, and within that darkness, shapes that hurt to perceive directly. The Void Lords were beings of pure negation, entities that existed to unmake everything that was, and their emergence into the physical world would mean the end of all life in Aethermoor. Below them, Queen Leanna led a charge of combined ice and earth magic that froze a wave of Void Wraiths solid before shattering them with targeted stone spikes. Her tactical brilliance had adapted quickly to commanding mixed forces, and her soldiers followed her with the devotion born of shared understanding. Prince Rashid coordinated the aerial assault, his sun magic creating platforms of solid light that allowed Forest Clan archers to rain arrows from impossible angles, while Mountain Kingdom siege engines launched projectiles enhanced with desert fire. The cooperation between traditionally rival forces was seamless, born of the trust forged through the Heartstone's revelations. King Magnus had taken personal command of the front lines, his warhammer crackling with harmony magic as he led combined infantry formations against the largest concentrations of shadow creatures. His earth magic provided defensive barriers, while ice magic created killing fields, and sunfire eliminated any void wraiths that broke through. Elder Theron stood at the center of the allied formation, his connection to the natural world allowing him to coordinate the harmony magic that flowed between all the different forces. Through him, the battlefield itself became a weapon, with plants and stones and even the air itself turning against the invading darkness. But despite their unprecedented cooperation and the power of their combined magic, the allied forces were being slowly pushed back. The Void Wraiths seemed endless, and each one destroyed was replaced by 2 more emerging from the growing rifts. Worse, the shadow creatures were learning, adapting their tactics to counter the harmony magic that had initially driven them back.
We can't hold them much longer.
Liana's voice reached Kael through the magical communication network that Theron maintained.
The rifts are expanding faster than we can seal them, and our forces are beginning to tire.
Kael knew she was right. The battle had been raging for hours, and even harmony magic had its limits when faced with an enemy that existed to consume and destroy. The ancient seals weren't just weakening. They were failing completely. And soon the Void Lords would break through in their full terrible glory. Pyraxis, Kael said through their bond, his voice heavy with the weight of destiny. It's time. The great dragon's response carried both sorrow and pride. I know, young guardian. The prophecies were clear about the price of victory. Are you certain this is the only way? Kael looked down at the battlefield where thousands of soldiers from 4 different kingdoms fought and died together, their unity forged in the crucible of shared danger. He thought of all the people in all the kingdoms who depended on this battle's outcome, all the lives that would be lost if the Void Lords succeeded in their ancient hunger. The sealing ritual requires the willing sacrifice of a dragon and rider pair, Kael said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. Our life force, freely given, can renew the ancient bindings and push the Void Lords back into the depths. It's the only way to save everyone else. Pyraxis banked toward the largest rift, her ancient wings carrying them through a storm of shadow and malevolence that would have destroyed any lesser being. As they approached the tear in reality, Kael could see the Void Lords beginning to push through entities of such pure negation that looking at them directly caused physical pain. All forces, fall back to minimum safe distance, Kael commanded through the communication network. Prepare for sealing ritual activation. The Allied armies began their withdrawal, but not in panic or defeat. The harmony magic that bound them together carried Kael's intentions, and every soldier understood what was about to happen. They retreated with discipline and purpose, creating the space needed for the ancient ritual, while maintaining defensive positions against the pursuing Void Wraiths. As Pyraxis reached the edge of the Great Rift, Kael began the incantations that his grandfather had taught him, words in the old tongue that had been spoken by dragon riders for 1,000 years. The ritual was simple in concept but devastating in execution. The complete sacrifice of dragon and rider life force to create a barrier that the Void Lords could not cross. I have been honored to share this bond with you, Pyraxis said, as the ritual magic began to build around them, her mental voice warm with affection despite the approaching end. You have become the guardian that your grandfather hoped you would be. And you have been the wisest teacher and truest friend I could have asked for. Kael cried, feeling tears streaming down his face as their shared life force began to flow into the ritual pattern. Thank you for everything, old friend. The sealing magic erupted from their joined sacrifice like a star being born, pure light that drove back the darkness and began weaving new barriers across the rifts in reality. The Void Lords shrieked in fury as they were pushed back into the depths, their forms dissolving as the renewed seals cut off their connection to the physical world. But as the light of the ritual reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The harmony magic that flowed between the Allied armies suddenly surged upward, connecting with the sealing ritual and adding its power to the ancient working. The trust and cooperation that had been forged between the kingdoms created a resonance that amplified the sacrifice beyond anything the original dragon riders had achieved. Instead of simply renewing the old seals, the combined magic began creating something new. Barriers that were not just stronger, but fundamentally different, woven from the unity of 5 kingdoms rather than the power of a single order. The Void Lords found themselves not just pushed back but actively rejected by a reality that had been transformed through cooperation and shared purpose. As the ritual reached its climax, Kael felt his consciousness beginning to fade, his life force flowing into the great working that would protect Aethermoor for generations to come. But in those final moments, he also felt something else. The echo of every person who had contributed to the harmony magic, their combined will to protect and preserve, creating a legacy that would outlast any individual sacrifice. The light of the sealing ritual blazed across the entire continent, visible from every kingdom and felt by every living being. When it finally faded, the rifts in reality had been sealed with barriers of crystallized harmony magic, and the Void Wraiths that remained in the physical world began dissolving as their connection to the ancient hunger was severed. On the battlefield below, the Allied armies stood in awed silence as they realized that the impossible had been achieved. The Void Lords had been banished, the ancient seals renewed, and the threat that had hung over Aethermoor for centuries had finally been ended. But the victory had come at a price that would be remembered for, as long as the kingdoms endured. Where Kael and Pyraxis had made their sacrifice, a pillar of crystallized light now stood, its surface showing glimpses of the dragon and rider who had given everything to save their world. The last guardian had fulfilled his destiny, and in doing so, had created the foundation for a new age of cooperation and peace between the kingdoms of Aethermoor. Chapter 10, Crown of Unity. 1 year after the Battle of the Central Wastelands, the 4 kingdoms of Aethermoor gathered to commemorate the sacrifice that had saved their world, and to formalize the alliance that had grown from shared struggle. The ceremony took place at the Pillar of Light, the crystallized monument that marked where Kael Dragonheart and Pyraxis had given their lives to renew the ancient seals. Queen Liana stood before the pillar in robes of white and silver, her ice-blue eyes reflecting the soft radiance that emanated from the crystallized harmony magic. Beside her, Prince Rashid wore the gold and crimson of the Desert Kingdoms, while King Magnus had donned his finest ceremonial armor, its bronze surface polished to mirror brightness. Elder Theron completed the circle, his robes of living wood and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze that seemed to flow constantly around the memorial site. We gather today not as separate kingdoms, but as one people united by shared purpose. Liana began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd of soldiers, mages, and citizens from all 4 realms. The sacrifice made here has given us more than victory over ancient darkness, it has given us the chance to build something better than what came before. The alliance of Aethermoor, as it had come to be known, was unlike any political structure the continent had ever seen. Each kingdom maintained its independence and unique culture. But they were bound together by treaties that emphasized cooperation over competition, mutual aid over territorial expansion. The harmony magic that had been forged in battle now flowed through permanent channels between the realms, allowing for unprecedented collaboration in everything from trade to magical research. The Dragon Riders are gone, Rashid said, his voice carrying both sorrow and hope, but their legacy lives on in the bonds we have forged. Where once there was one order of guardians, now we have 4 kingdoms united in the protection of our world. The changes had been remarkable to witness. The Ice Realm's crystal-growing techniques were being combined with the Mountain Kingdom's metalworking to create new forms of architecture that were both beautiful and practical. Desert irrigation methods were being adapted to help the forest clans manage their watersheds, while forest preservation techniques were being used to restore areas damaged by mining operations. Most importantly, the magical traditions of each kingdom were no longer jealously guarded secrets, but shared knowledge that enhanced all their capabilities. Young mages from different realms studied together, learning to weave harmony magic that was stronger than any single tradition could achieve alone. The Void Wraiths taught us that division makes us vulnerable, Magnus said, his gruff voice softened by genuine emotion. But Kael Dragonheart showed us that unity makes us unbreakable. The mountain clans have always valued strength, and I have learned that there is no strength greater than that which comes from standing together. Elder Theron stepped forward, placing his hand on the pillar of light, and feeling the echo of the sacrifice that had created it. The forest remembers all things, and it will remember this day, when the kingdoms chose cooperation over conflict, when they honored the sacrifice of the last guardian by becoming guardians themselves. As the formal ceremony concluded, representatives from each kingdom came forward to place offerings at the base of the pillar. Ice flowers that would never melt, carved from Liana's realm. Golden sand formed into intricate patterns by Rashid's desert mages. Perfectly crafted metal sculptures from Magnus's finest smiths. Living wreaths that would grow and flourish from Theron's forest gardens. But perhaps the most significant offering came from an unexpected source. A group of young people from all 4 kingdoms had been working together for months, using harmony magic to create something that had never existed before. A dragon egg, formed from crystallized magic and the combined will of the Alliance. "We cannot bring back Kael and Pyraxis," said the young woman who led the group, her robes showing the mixed colors of all 4 kingdoms. "But we can ensure that their legacy continues. This egg will hatch when Aethermoor has need of guardians again, and the dragon that emerges will be bonded not to a single rider but to the Alliance itself." The egg was placed in a place of honor at the pillar's base, its surface swirling with the colors of ice and earth, sun and forest, all harmonized into something new and beautiful. It would remain there, tended by volunteers from all the kingdoms, a symbol of hope and renewal that would inspire future generations. As the crowds began to disperse, the 4 rulers remained at the pillar, each lost in their own thoughts about how much had changed since that desperate day when a dragon rider had first warned them of ancient threats. The wars that had seemed so important a year ago now felt like distant memories, their causes forgotten in the face of greater purposes. "Do you think he knew?" Liana asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the swirling patterns within the crystallized light. "Do you think Kael understood what his sacrifice would create?" Theron smiled, his connection to the natural world allowing him to sense the echoes of consciousness that still lingered in the pillar. "I believe he hoped. The forest whispers that his spirit and Pyraxis's essence live on in the harmony magic that flows between our kingdoms. They are not truly gone. They have become part of something larger." As the sun set over the central wastelands, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the pillar of light began to glow more brightly, its radiance spreading across the landscape that had once been cursed and barren. Where the light touched, new growth began to appear. Not the twisted vegetation that had struggled to survive in the corrupted soil, but healthy plants that spoke of renewal and hope. The wastelands were healing, just as the kingdoms were healing from centuries of conflict and mistrust. It would take time, perhaps generations, but the foundation had been laid for a future where cooperation replaced competition, where unity strengthened rather than threatened individual identity. The Alliance of Aethermoor would face new challenges in the years to come, but they would face them together, guided by the memory of a dragon rider who had shown them that the greatest victories came not from conquest, but from sacrifice, not from division, but from unity. The age of the dragon riders was over, but the age of harmony had begun. And it would endure as long as people remembered the price of peace and the value of standing together against the darkness. In the growing twilight, the four rulers made their way back to their respective kingdoms, but they carried with them the bonds forged in battle and the promise of a better tomorrow. The crown of unity had been earned through sacrifice and sealed with hope, and it would shine as brightly as the pillar of light for all the generations yet to come.